Kindness offered at the precise moment a person expects none at all is the most disorienting gift in the world. Sorcha was counting pennies at the corner of Addison Lane when the rain began in earnest. Not the polite drizzle that London used as a preliminary throat clearing, but the sudden, cold, committed kind that soaked through wool in under a minute. She pressed herself against the iron gate of Brackett's counting house, her ledger tucked under one arm, and her other hand working the clasp of the umbrella she had purchased second-hand from a market stall 3 years prior. The umbrella opened. The left rib did not deploy with the rest. It hung, kinked and sad, so that the canopy tilted and shed water in a concentrated stream directly onto her left shoulder instead of dispersing it properly. She adjusted her grip. She tilted the handle. The rib hung on regardless. This was the 4th consecutive morning she had made this walk from Mrs. Pallister's lodging house on Grieve Street to Brackett's, and the 4th consecutive morning the umbrella had done precisely this. She had not thrown it away. It cost 1 shilling and 4pence to replace, and 1 shilling and 4pence was half of what remained between herself and the next fortnight's rent after she paid the coal bill. So the umbrella remained. So did the wet shoulder. She arrived at Brackett's counting house 11 minutes before 7, unlocked the inner office with her own key, a detail that still made the ledger clerk, Mr. Finch, look at her with visible bewilderment every morning, and set her coat and the broken umbrella on the hook by the fire that had not yet been lit. She lit it herself. She was already feeding figures from the previous day's receipts into the main column before any of the other clerks arrived. Sorcha was not supposed to be here. That sentence could be understood 2 ways. She was not supposed to be employed in this capacity, because women did not sit at the senior analyst desk in counting houses in the year 1887, except when there were no alternatives, and the proprietor was desperate enough. She was also not supposed to be in this city at all, in this coat, in these circumstances. 18 months ago she had been Miss Sorcha Calloway of Ballinscar, County Antrim, daughter of a man who had kept a decent estate with 40 tenants and a house that had running water from the hill springs. Then the estate had gone in settlement of debts her father had not, she later discovered, accrued himself. Then her father had gone, quietly, in his sleep, on the night she found out, and she had gone to England on the only money she had, which was £11 and a return rail ticket she never used. Mr. Finch arrived at 7:30. He said nothing to her, as was customary. Mrs. Vance, the proprietor's wife who managed the debtor's correspondence, arrived at 8 and said morning at the threshold without looking up. Sorcha said morning back. These were the acceptable social transactions of her day. She had stopped expecting more than this. Survival required constant vigilance, and grief required time, and she had not had time in 18 months, and did not expect to have it soon. She carried her father's absence like a stone she had agreed to hold just briefly, and could not seem to put down. At 10 minutes past 8, the front door opened. She heard it before she saw it. The quality of sound in the outer office changed, the way sound changes when something large enters a space that did not previously contain it. She heard Finch's chair scrape back. She heard Mrs. Vance's pen stop. She heard the particular quality of 2 people standing involuntarily at attention and not quite understanding why they had done it. Sorcha looked up. The man in the doorway was perhaps 35. He was very tall, which the low ceiling of Brackett's outer office made more apparent than it might have been outdoors. He wore a greatcoat of charcoal wool and no hat, which was unusual in the rain, and he carried his hat in his hand, which was equally unusual, because it meant the rain had not inconvenienced him enough to prompt him to use the hat. He had dark hair, cut short, and gray eyes with the specific quality of gray that appears in winter sky just before a weather event. Not the pleasant gray of mist, but the pressurized gray of something imminent. His jaw was a clean, blunt line. He was the sort of man whose presence did not announce itself loudly. It simply rearranged the available space. He looked at Mrs. Vance. "I require," he said, "the senior accounts analyst." His voice was low. It was not theatrical. It simply carried. Mrs. Vance opened her mouth, closed it, and looked involuntarily at Sorcha's office door, which was ajar. This was telling. Mrs. Vance had been looking through, rather than at, Sorcha for 3 months. Sorcha set down her pen and walked to the door. "I am the senior analyst," she said. "How may I help you?" The gray eyes moved to her without hurry. He did not react to her being a woman in this role, which was itself unusual enough to note. He simply looked at her with the attentiveness of a man accustomed to assessing things quickly and accurately. "I have a matter requiring discretion," he said. "And arithmetic. Both are available," she said. "Come in." She learned, in the next 4 minutes, that he was Dorian Ashmore, the Duke of Varenmore, and that he had come to Brackett's counting house specifically because it was not the firm his family had used for 3 generations, because the matter in question required distance from his usual advisers, because it concerned a debt of £11,000 owed by one Lord Alistair Crewe, a man whose name Sorcha knew, as it happened, because Crewe's name appeared in the margin of her father's papers as the man who had arranged the sale of Ballinskar under the guise of settling a mortgage that Sorcha had since come to believe was falsified. She did not say this. She did not yet say this. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her and listened. Lord Crewe, it appeared, had borrowed £11,000 from the Varenmore estate's private accounts, routed through a financial intermediary in Edinburgh and disguised as a legitimate investment instrument, and had been servicing only the interest for the past 4 years, while the principal gathered quietly in the dark. The Duke had discovered it 8 days ago when he undertook a personal audit of accounts his late father had maintained, and he had come to Brackett's rather than his solicitors because, as he said with brief precision, solicitors talk. "I do not talk," Sorcha said. He looked at her again with that assessing quality. "I gathered," she said. "I will need the original instrument documentation, the Edinburgh intermediary's records, and 4 years of interest payment receipts. I have them." He placed a leather satchel on the edge of the desk. She opened it. The documents inside were organized. He had organized them himself. She could tell. No clerk would have sorted them in this particular logical order, grouped by date span rather than category, which was efficient if unconventional. She noted this. She did not remark on it. "Give me 2 days," she said. He nodded once and stood. He was nearly at the door when she said, without quite planning to, "Lord Crewe arranged the sale of an estate in County Antrim 18 months ago, Ballinskar, through a similar instrument, I believe, a falsified mortgage settlement." Dorian turned. He was still. "You believe?" "I can prove it," she said. "If I have access to the Edinburgh intermediary's records, they will connect." A pause that was 4 seconds long. She counted them. "Whose estate?" he said. "Mine," she said. "My father's." He stood in the doorway of the outer office of Brackett's counting house, with rain still visible through the front glass, and the weight of what she had said settling between them. He did not say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. She had no particular use for sorrow offered by strangers, however well-intentioned. He said, "Then you will have the full Edinburgh file." He left. Finch and Mrs. Vance stood in the outer office, in the particular silence of people who have witnessed something they cannot categorize. Sorcha closed the door, returned to her desk, and opened the satchel. She worked for 9 hours without stopping. The documents were not simple. Crewe had been careful, in the way that genuinely dangerous men are careful, not fastidiously, but naturally, as though deception were a native grammar he had always spoken. The Edinburgh intermediary, a firm called Cairn and Sutherland, had processed at least 14 transactions of similar shape over the past 7 years. She could see the pattern in the interest schedules, the way a cartographer sees a river system. Each individual tributary looked like an independent line until you pulled back and recognized the drainage pattern. All of them fed to the same basin. All of them bore Crewe's mark in the same obscured fashion. By the 4th hour, she was no longer thinking about the Duke or the debt. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about the Tuesday in October when she had sat in the parlor at Ballinskar with a solicitor named Pemberton, reading from a document that seemed to describe a reality she did not recognize. A mortgage in her father's name, against a sum her father had supposedly borrowed and never repaid, collateralized against the house and land. Her father had sat very straight in the chair beside her and not spoken for a long time, and then he had said quietly, "I did not sign this." And Pemberton had looked at him over his spectacles and said equally quietly, "The instrument bears your signature, Mr. Calloway." She found the signature in the Edinburgh file at 4:30 in the afternoon. Or rather, she found the template of the signature, an original specimen document from Cairn and Sutherland's archive, a draft instrument dated 18 months before the Balanskar mortgage, bearing a signature that had clearly served as the model for the forgery. The hand was not her father's. The proportions were wrong by 3 consistent small degrees, the kind of 3 degrees only visible when you had spent the better part of an afternoon training your eye on a man's actual correspondence, which she had, because she had kept his letters. She was still holding the specimen document at 6:30 when Finch knocked on the door and said the building needed to be locked. She walked home in the rain without the umbrella because she had left it on the hook and the fire had gone out and the hook was in the cold dark of an already locked building, and by the time she was halfway along Addison Lane, she did not particularly notice the rain. Her father had been right. He had known he had not signed it. He had known, and no one had believed him, and no one had looked, and he had died with that knowledge unremedied. And it had been unremedied because she had not had the Edinburgh file. She had not had the Edinburgh file because she had not had £11,000 worth of Duke of Varenmore to knock on the right door. She did not cry. She had cried once, on the train from Belfast to Dublin, in a compartment she shared with a woman traveling with a very old spaniel, and the woman had offered her a handkerchief without comment, and Sorcha had used it and returned it with thanks, and that had been the entire extent of it. She did not cry in her lodging room that night either. She sat at the small table under the window and made a second copy of her findings in her own handwriting and wrapped both copies separately in oil paper. She slept 4 hours. She arrived at Brackett's before anyone the next morning and had both the analytical report and the connecting evidence for Balanskar completed and indexed before 8 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, the Duke arrived again, without announcement, in the same charcoal greatcoat. She handed him the report. He sat in the client's chair and read it completely. He did not skim. She watched him read and thought that a man who reads his own documents sequentially and completely, rather than skipping to conclusions, is a man who does not expect other people to be wrong. He turned the last page. He was quiet for a moment. 14 instruments, he said. 14 confirmed, possibly 17, if 2 additional Edinburgh accounts I cannot directly access follow the same pattern. And Balanskar. Connected through the specimen signature and the routing code on page 11. The mortgage your Edinburgh file shows as settled in March of '86. It was Balanskar. Different reference name to obscure the geographic connection, but the routing code is Cairn and Sutherland's Antrim office, same code as mine. He set the report on the desk. He looked at her. This is enough to ruin him. It is enough, she said precisely, to expose him. There was a distinction, and he understood that she was drawing it. He said, yes. Then he said, I intend to take this to a King's Council next week. It will become a public matter. Good, she said. He stood. He was looking at the window behind her, at the rain still coming, and then at the desk, and then, with the brief quality of a man who has noticed something and is deciding whether to remark on it, at the broken umbrella on the hook by the now lit fire. That umbrella, he said. She glanced at it. It has a broken rib. I know. Does it open? Partially. He looked at it for another second in the particular way that she was beginning to recognize as his mode of paying full attention to something. Then he looked back at her. Your fee, he said. Brackett's rate, plus an additional consultancy supplement. My man of business will arrange it. The rate is sufficient, she said. The supplement is not optional, he said. Not harshly. It was simply a statement of fact, the way most of his sentences were statements of fact. He picked up his hat and left. The supplement, when his man of business delivered it 2 days later, was £40. £40 was, she calculated, while standing in the outer office with Finch and Mrs. Vance both watching, with the elaborate casualness of people pretending not to watch, slightly more than 5 months of her current salary. She put the envelope in her coat pocket and went back to her desk and sat down and looked at the fire. £40. The coal bill would no longer be a negotiation. The broken umbrella could be replaced 3 dozen times. She could begin, in some small but structural sense, to breathe. She did not immediately spend it. She put it in the locked box under her bed and went back to counting figures for the week's other clients. And she thought about what her father had said about money, that it was not comfort and it was not safety, but it was the scaffolding on which you could build things that were. The public proceedings against Lord Crewe commenced 6 weeks later. The announcement appeared in the Times on a Tuesday morning in November, and Sorcha read it over her tea at Mrs. Pallister's lodging table, with the careful neutrality of someone whose name did not appear in the article, but whose arithmetic constituted its backbone. Crewe was named. The Edinburgh firm was named. The 14 instruments were described in general terms. One paragraph noted that the late Thomas Calloway of Ballinscar, County Antrim, was among the parties whose estate had been improperly obtained through a falsified instrument, and that the matter was under review by the relevant legal authorities. Her father's name in the newspaper, his name, with late before it, in a paragraph that also contained the word improperly. She folded the paper at the table and looked out the window at the November street. Mrs. Pallister was heating water in the kitchen. A cat that lived on the sill outside shifted its weight. Sorcha sat very still and let herself, for perhaps the first time in 18 months, simply feel the shape of it, not the anger, and not the injustice, and not the arithmetic of what was owed and what might be recovered. Just the fact that her father had been right, that he had known it, that she had found the document that proved it, that he would not know she had found it. She sat at the table until the tea was cold, and then she washed her cup and went to work. 12 days after the Times announcement, a letter arrived at Brackett's counting house, addressed to her directly. The handwriting on the envelope was the same handwriting that had organized the Edinburgh satchel. Brief, logical groupings. She opened it at her desk. It contained 3 sentences. The first informed her that the Varenmore legal team was preparing a civil claim on behalf of all 14 affected parties, and that her evidence would be formally submitted. The second asked whether she would be willing to present her analysis in person before his solicitors and a King's Counsel at Varenmore House on the 23rd of the month. The third sentence said, "Your umbrella is still in your office. It should not still be broken." She stared at the third sentence for a moment. Then she wrote back. She agreed to the 23rd. She made no comment on the umbrella. 19 days passed. She slept better. She replaced the coal bill. She bought new boot heels. She did not replace the umbrella. Varenmore House was in Mayfair, on a street where the houses were so sure of their own importance. They seemed to have become geological. Stone facades, railings that gleamed, windows so clean they looked like openings into a different season. She arrived on the morning of the 23rd at 9 o'clock in her best coat, which was a dark blue wool with 2 buttons replaced in a slightly different shade she hoped was not obvious in lamplight, and her broken umbrella because it was raining and it remained the umbrella she owned. She tilted it at the familiar angle, accepted the familiar wet shoulder, and knocked at the servant's entrance because she was a professional attendee at a legal consultation, not a social guest, and she had learned to be precise about that distinction. The butler who answered did not take her to the servants' hall. He looked at her for exactly 1 second and then said, "Miss Calloway, I was instructed to bring you directly through," and he brought her through the main entrance hall instead, which was a choice someone had made in advance of her arrival, and she was aware of that, and she walked through it without comment. The solicitors were already present in the library, 2 of them, both senior, both with the practiced blankness of men who had been told to take this unusual analytical report seriously and were in the process of deciding how to feel about the fact that the analyst was a woman. The King's Counsel was a tall, dry-voiced man named Hartley, who showed no reaction whatsoever to her, which she took as a good sign. There were 2 additional men she did not recognize, whom she later understood to be the Varenmore estate's senior man of business and a financial investigator from Scotland Yard. The Duke was not present when she entered the room. He arrived 12 minutes later, which she noted, because she had the sense that his 12 minutes were not discourtesy, but a calibration, that he had been waiting until she was settled before he came in, so that she would not be introduced while still finding her feet. She could not be certain of this. She thought it likely. He sat at the head of the library table. He said, "Gentlemen, and Miss Calloway, thank you." Then he looked at Hartley and said, "She will present the analysis. Please direct your questions to her." She presented for 40 minutes. She had not prepared a formal address. She was an analyst, not an orator. But she had her indexed report, and she knew every figure in it, and she answered every question Hartley put to her, with the flat, unembellished precision that was the only register in which she was comfortable operating. One of the solicitors interrupted twice with questions she could tell were designed to probe whether she truly understood the material or had been handed conclusions by someone else. She answered both questions with specific numerical references and returned to her thread without pausing. He did not interrupt a third time. When she finished, Hartley looked at the Duke. "The analysis is sound," he said. Then he looked at Sorcha and said, as though this were a minor addendum, "Exceptional, in fact." The room debriefed for another hour. Legal procedures were outlined. Sorcha's sworn statement would be required. Arrangements would be made. The Balanskar matter would be formally included in the civil claim. The anticipated outcome was the recovery of the estate, or its equivalent cash value, which at current market rates was somewhere between £7,000 and £9,000, though the process would take time. She absorbed this with her hands folded on the table and her expression level. After the others had left, she remained because one of the solicitors needed a correction notation on the document copy she had provided, and by the time this was settled, the library was empty except for the Duke, who was at the far end of the room, looking at the bookshelves in the particular way she had come to recognize as his mode of waiting, without announcing that he was waiting. She gathered her copies into the satchel she had brought. He turned. "Hartley is not easily impressed," he said. "I noticed," she said. He was impressed. "It was a sound analysis," she said. "The material warranted it." He looked at her, the same thorough, unhurried look she had first received in Brackett's outer office. Then he crossed the room to the fireplace, above which hung a number of framed items she had not previously paid attention to. A small oil painting, a letter in glass, and she stopped. Hanging between the letter and the oil painting, mounted on a small hook, was her umbrella, not a different umbrella, hers. The broken rib still kinked at its familiar angle, so that the whole thing listed to the left with the cheerful resignation of something that had long since made peace with its own imperfection. She stared at it. "You had it repaired," she said. Then she looked more closely. He had not had it repaired. The rib was still broken. "You didn't have it repaired." "No," he said. "You put it on your wall." "Yes." She turned and looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the pause now for what it was. Not the silence of a man composing a performance, but of a man saying something true, and taking the half-second required to confirm he was going to say it. "Because," he said, "you offered it anyway." She said nothing. "You had a broken thing," he said, "and someone needed covering, and you offered it without calculation, and without asking what you'd get in return. I have not seen that done in some time." She had, in fact, offered the umbrella. She knew precisely when. It had been the morning he first came to Brackett's. She had seen him on the steps in the rain trying to flag a hansom, and she had stopped and tilted the broken canopy toward him for the 90 seconds it took for the cab to stop, and she had not thought it was remarkable. It was simply what you did when someone was standing in the rain and you had something covering you. She had not known who he was. She had simply done it. "It did not cover much," she said. "The rib is broken." "It covered enough," he said. He had his hands clasped behind his back, which was a posture she recognized on him now as a kind of self-containment, a deliberate discipline. "I kept it because I wanted to remember that the impulse exists, that there are still people who—" He stopped. Then, it seemed worth keeping. She looked at the umbrella on the wall of the Duke of Varenmore's library. She looked at the kinked left rib and the listing canopy and the second-hand handle, and she thought that she had purchased this object for 1 shilling and 4pence, and it had spent 3 years failing to keep her dry on the left side, and she had kept it because 1 shilling and 4pence was the margin between her and disaster, and now it was hanging on a wall in Mayfair between a small oil painting and a letter under glass, and this was possibly the strangest thing that had happened to her in a very strange 18 months. "Your Grace," she said. "Dorian," he said. Then, with the quiet precision of a man issuing a correction to a document rather than declaring himself, he said, "We are past the point where your Grace is accurate." She considered this for a moment. "Dorian," she said, "I need to say something plainly. Please." "I am not a charitable case," she said. "I am aware that the circumstances create a certain optics. Estate lost, father gone, employed in a role I should not need to hold. I am aware that from the outside it resembles the sort of situation in which a person of your resources might feel moved to intervene in a manner I would be grateful for, and I want to be precise. Gratitude is not what I am capable of offering in return for intervention of that nature, and I am not looking for it. He was very still. What are you looking for? She looked at him. This was the question. She had not asked herself this question in any useful form since the night on the train from Belfast to Dublin, when she had still been a person with a past and had not yet become a person entirely occupied with the present. She said, I want the Balenscar claim settled, not as a gift from your legal team, but as the outcome of my own documented evidence. Because it is. I want to continue working at the level I am working. She stopped. What did she want? I want to be spoken to, the way you speak to me in this room, she said, like a person whose thinking has weight. Something shifted in his expression, not a dramatic shift, not the thaw of ice in a film, not a performance, just the quiet relocation of something that had been held under considerable tension and was now, fractionally, not. The claim will be settled on the documented evidence, he said. It already is. My legal team are filing it because it is legally valid, not as a courtesy to you. Hartley would not proceed otherwise, and I would not ask him to. A pause. And I have been speaking to you this way because your thinking has weight. These are not things I am offering. They are things that are already true. She stood in the library in her replaced boot heels and her dark blue coat with the two mismatched buttons and looked at the Duke of Varenmore, who had placed her broken umbrella on his wall and read 14 financial instruments from beginning to end, and had not been surprised that a woman was the senior analyst, and had sent his butler to bring her through the front entrance, and had just told her, with the unornamented directness she had come to expect from him, that she was already what she was asking to be recognized as. Then, she said slowly, what are you asking? He unclasped his hands from behind his back. He crossed the remaining distance between them, not rapidly, not dramatically, at the measured pace of a man who has made a decision and is executing it with complete intent. He stopped within arm's reach. I am asking, he said, whether you would be willing to have dinner with me, not as a client, not as your Grace and his analyst. He paused, as Dorian and Sorcha. She looked at him for a long moment. Rain moved against the library windows. The fire settled. The broken umbrella listed on its hook. I would want it understood, she said, that I will continue working. Of course. And that if you attempt at any point to arrange things on my behalf without consulting me first, I will find it insufferable and say so. I would expect nothing less, he said. And there it was, something in his expression she had not yet seen, not the assessing gray sky attentiveness, and not the quiet formidable stillness, but something warmer and more personal, something that suggested the man who existed before the title had perhaps been someone with a longer fuse and a less disciplined face, and that he was in the process of allowing that man occasional access to the exterior. I should tell you, he said, that I find your insufferable extremely tolerable. She did not smile, quite. She felt the edges of it and let them stay at the edges. Dinner then, she said. On Thursday. I have accounts due on Wednesday that require my full attention. Thursday is entirely acceptable, he said. She buckled her satchel and put on her coat. He walked with her to the entrance hall, which, she was aware, was not something a duke was required to do for a professional attendee. The butler appeared with her things. The broken umbrella had been retrieved from the library. She could see it in the butler's hands. She looked at Dorian. That, she said, stays on your wall. He looked at the umbrella and then at her. I intended it to, he said. She walked out into the November rain on Mayfair's stone sureness of a street without an umbrella, because hers was hanging in a library behind her, and she had decided she could afford a new one, and because the rain was not particularly worse than any other inconvenience she had managed, and she was, if nothing else, a woman who managed inconveniences. She would buy the replacement tomorrow, 1 shilling and 4pence, or perhaps slightly more if she chose something with functioning ribs, which struck her now as a reasonable extravagance. The Balenscar claim was proceeding. Her father's name was in the Times attached to the word improperly, and soon it would be in the Times attached to the word vindicated. She had dinner to attend on Thursday with a man who kept broken things on his walls because he found them worth remembering. She turned up her collar and walked in the direction of the cab stand. There was a great deal still to navigate. The claim, the legal proceedings, the dozen small logistical facts of a life being reconstructed from its foundations. There was grief she had not yet had full time to sit with, and work she was very good at, and the particular difficult pleasure of being taken seriously by someone who had the stature to take you any other way and had chosen not to. None of it was resolved, not truly, not yet. But there is a particular moment in any long reconstruction when the scaffold shows itself to be solid, when you put weight on it and it holds, and you allow yourself to understand that the building will stand. Sorcha had found 14 forged instruments in a leather satchel and followed the pattern all the way back to the document that proved her father right. She had done this with her own arithmetic, in the light of a fire she had lit herself. And somewhere on the other side of that November street, maybe you already know what it is to hold a broken thing and offer it anyway, not because it is enough, but because it is what you have, and you have learned by some difficult education that it is enough to reach across with whatever is in your hands. What she did not know, walking toward the cab stand, was that 11 weeks from now the Balanskar matter would be settled. 23 weeks from that, she and Dorian would be married, at a quiet ceremony, with no announcement in the society pages, because they had agreed that what they were building was not for the society pages. The broken umbrella would remain on the library wall for the rest of their lives, and when people asked about it, because it was unmistakably incongruous with everything else on that wall, he would say only that it reminded him what competence looked like when it was paired with generosity, and she would say nothing, because she had never needed to explain herself, and she did not intend to begin.